this. That's right. The report.
Yes,
Okay.
like it'll say appendix and then, yeah.
Just take it out.
Did you finish all 111 pages?
Pardon?
Did you finish all 111 pages that we have to read?
Oh, actually, this
Right, right.
No. It did put me to sleep. I did have to take a nap this afternoon. Like, I gotta go lay down. I
I need
can't
to
get
go
my eyes
through
open.
the transportation and we must
And
leave
they-
everyone back.
You know, and I made
Mobility
a mistake of
stuff.
starting at the beginning.
So maybe
Yeah.
we should chat
God,
about,
yeah.
You know, it just,
you know, come into that
I don't know,
chapter.
Bang, bang, bang.
You want to talk about that a little bit today?
kind of wonder why we're not just
No, I just,
starting at the
yeah,
beginning.
like we'll
Yeah.
figure out
Oh,
what
okay.
those look like, I think, and maybe it'll come out during their conversation.
Because if we're not starting at the
See,
beginning,
that makes
we're jumping around. 'cause
Okay,
it's
I
easy to
know.
understand that.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody, to
Why don't we
the
have that order?
Traverse City Planning Commission regular meeting. It's Tuesday, April 2nd. Glad to see everyone here on this day. I would like to start with our land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the territory of the Ottawa and Chippewa peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Thank you for your strength and resilience in protecting this land and inspiring us to uphold our responsibilities to do the same. Roll call.
Commissioner Tuller,
Here.
Commissioner Hershey,
Here.
Commissioner Treadwell, Commissioner Knapp,
Here.
Commissioner O'Brien,
Here.
Commissioner Heller,
Here.
Commissioner McGillivray,
Here,
Commissioner Anderson,
Here.
and Commissioner George.
Here. Thank you. Are there any announcements?
None at this time from staff.
Anyone else have any announcements to make?
Actually, I will make one announcement if I can. So we've been instructed by Leah, who videotapes, to really speak into the mics in this room. Otherwise, people will not be able to hear you. So really try to make that happen.
And in addition, the mics don't project like they do in the chambers, so it doesn't sound like you're speaking into the mic, but you are.
Thank you. Item number 4, approval of minutes of the regular meeting, March 5th, 2024, and the Planning Commission study session of March 19th, 2024. Do I have a motion?
Motion. Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion before we vote? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Is there any old business? So that moves us into the item for tonight, new business, the draft master plan discussion and feedback. This has been a really amazing, thorough, and exciting project that has taken a lot of staff time, a lot of input from our community, and from the people around this table. So exciting to be able to talk about it tonight. So, Mr. Winter, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. This is very exciting. We've been working for about 2 years now on this project. So this represents a culmination of a lot of work from a lot of people. First of whom I want to introduce is Sarah Kopriva, if you have not yet met her. She is the project lead from Beckett and Rader, our consultant team on this project. So she's been with us all along. She's a local resident here, has worked in Blair Township, Green Lake, Elmwood. So she's got a good Garfield of all the communities we have in our area and as well as our region. So we've broken this down for you over the next 5 weeks of how we're going to review this. So the master plan and the mobility action plan are being designed to be adopted as one document, with the mobility action plan serving as a sub area or subtopic plan within the master plan. So a master plan is a comprehensive land use plan that looks at all the interactions related to land use in a community. Because of that, master plans oftentimes have a 30,000-foot view because you're looking at everything comprehensively. So there may be at times a level of detail on a specific topic that you may want to get into more. We can have those conversations of how we make that happen. One example is the mobility action plan. So that's why we did that as our first sub-area plan. We did it jointly with this process, and there's opportunities there to get into other topics in the community as time goes on. And what we would do in the future then is amend this master plan to adopt that new sub-area or subtopic plan as an additional appendix, like we will with the mobility action plan. So one thing to keep in mind is if you have zoning in your community, you are required to have a master plan. So we don't just do this because in order to have zoning, you have to have a master plan. A master plan is not legally binding. It is a document that is used by the community to help guide decisions related primarily to land use. But you'll see when we get to the magazine portion or the prescriptive part, some of it gets outside of just standard customary land use, and we'll be talking about that later in the month. I think that's kind of all I have right now. Are there questions on the master plan? I know we have a lot of new people. This is the first time it's coming to you. So when we set up this process, we created a leadership team. So it consisted of residents, city commissioners, planning commissioners, and staff. So they have been reviewing the drafts throughout the process. So they reviewed each chapter individually as they were written, provided feedback. That feedback was incorporated into the draft. The revised draft was sent to everyone. 2 weeks ago is when they met for the final time and decided to move it on to the Planning Commission. So we will be, as we talked at our joint meeting, reviewing this over the next 5 weeks, and then we'll send it to the City Commission. We're anticipating towards the end of June a public open house on the two plans. Once the mandatory 63-day review period ends, we'll bring it back to the Planning Commission. A public hearing is required. The Planning Commission will adopt it. May adopt it. It will go to the City Commission, who will then also need to adopt it for their ordinances. Questions so far on that? Okay. So in your memo, we broke down the next 5 weeks of the different topics we're going to cover. One thing I want to point out is the very first chapter was missed in the list on today's. So did anyone read the demographics chapter? Okay. So if you're fine, we will probably start going through that today. We built in a 6-day, or a 6th week, where if we need to revisit something or if one of these topics needs to carry over because you felt unprepared, we can always go back. We don't have, nothing's final at this point. So we're here to have conversations and discussions on it. So tonight then we'll be covering demographics, the chapter on housing, the one on neighborhoods, transportation, and then infrastructure and energy. Next week, we will be discussing the existing land use as it is in the city now, sustainability, health and safety, arts and culture, economic development, as well as plan review. One missing from that list that you might want to note as you're reading through it will be the sustainable tourism chapter. That's mixed in there, and that was left off that list. That will get us through what we're calling the supplemental portion. And we're probably going to try to find some more creative names. So the master plan, as you received it, comes in 2 parts. The first thick part is what we're calling the supplemental part. This is mostly research and data and things like that. You could think of it as this is the why. Okay? The narrow part, the magazine portion, this is the prescriptive part. This is the guiding component to the plan. So this is the how. So this is why we create a certain vision. This is how we achieve it over the next 5 years. So this is really the part that we want people to focus on. And we set that up intentionally because we wanted this part, really the meat and potatoes of it, to be something people could digest and read through, say, over a cup of coffee. This isn't going to get you there. But a master plan is supposed to be a repository of information on your community. And so that's why we still went through and did this very thorough component that looks at different types of data, tracks it over periods of time, and presents it as well as some regional context that we have. After the 9th, we will be switching over to the mobility action plan. So we'll go through that on the 9th, and then again on the 16th, and then again on the 23rd. And then we'll come back to the actionable part at the end. So we understand all the context. Now we're going to talk about the prescriptions. I do want to note that on the 16th, I will not be here and Sarah will not be here. Our consultants from Progressive AE who have been working on the mobility action plan will be here. And I will see that if Harry Burkholder, the interim CEO of the DDA, can be here because the DDA was a partner in that plan as well. So you'll be in good hands. We're just going to be at the national conference flying back that day and won't get in time to make it. Any questions then up until now? Okay. With that, I will kind of hand it over to Sarah to begin with demographics.
Well, actually, I'm going to start. I'm going to show you, we've been working on a story map, and Sean mentioned it just before the meeting a little bit about how you're going to be able to look at the master plan online and what it looks like and feels like, because we imagine that at least the supplemental part you may find that more people look at it there because you can click on a certain portion of the document to read versus picking up the whole 500 pages to read it. So let me get ahead. So in this in draft form, it doesn't have everything in here. Kind of a look at what we've been working on, or how you do this. This is living as well, you know, as are adopted, you'll add it on. We'll kind of scroll through here, the different of it. At the top, you can go down, just about guiding are in the beginning magazine. If you read through that, yet that we principles, and then kind of looking at the different sections. We're scrolling through here. So this will be available, like I said, once we get all done. Draft form. That's why it's editor form. Not published. I don't want to publish. I've gone through the process. So just wanted to beginning on the current Traverse City master plan and how this is all in the big document. Any questions? Okay. So briefly, I'm just going to touch on, you know, as we go chapter by chapter, each of kind of what this chapter is about, and then open it up for questions, comments, any concerns that we can talk about in that chapter. I'd like to try to focus on one topic at a time. So we'll start with demographics. If anybody has any questions on that, or if you really like a component of it, that's great to hear too, because we want to make sure that we also make an impact at certain times. So for demographics, this is this is a big chapter for you. It's based in the census. It has a lot of information here to digest for the area. And I guess I'll just leave it at that. This is really based in the data that we had available, either through the census or some other information, the community survey that's also done at the national level. It has a lot of good and interesting information in that.
If I may, there's one thing I want to talk about, how each chapter is sort of laid out. So at the beginning of each chapter, there's kind of like a brief summary that you'll see that kind of hits on some of the highlights of each chapter. Then you'll see call-out boxes throughout the chapters, one in green, one in like a light blue. There's two areas that we wanted to focus on as we were going through this. One is how the topics we're talking about relate to climate change, and those will be addressed in those green call-out boxes that you see throughout. And the second topic was equity. So you'll see those in blue, how we try to connect the dots between the topic that's being presented and the issue of equity or climate change. I will say, though, that as we talked about at the joint meeting, this is not a climate action plan. That would be an example of one of those subtopic plans that you drop below that 30,000 feet and get into the real detail of a specific issue, which is something that we will likely try to pursue in the future. I know when we hired our deputy planner / sustainability coordinator, part of that job description was leading the effort towards a sustainability or resiliency plan, which would be tied to climate action as well. So just wanted to present that.
Did anybody have any comments or questions on demographics they want to talk about?
Yeah, thank you. I noted that within the demographics section, there were several different definitions of geography, each with its own little borders. And, you know, we had the micropolitan statistical area, we had the Traverse City urbanized area, and then we also had the Traverse City region, which was just a 2 zip code definition. And I wondered, for my understanding of the context, what are the geographic boundaries for this particular plan that we're writing?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about. So in general, we're writing about the city of Traverse City as the area, but you can't look at the city in a vacuum without looking at adjacent areas. And so there are times when we look further out, either to immediately neighboring townships or counties. Some of the information that we have available is only available at certain levels. So the 2 zip codes, for instance, that's larger than the city of Traverse City. The city also has 2 zip codes in it, so we need to make sure to include everybody. And then you're also dealing, like I said, with other information that's either at a county level, but it's still important to that discussion. And you'll see that more kind of in the housing section chapter, where you see we're looking at some of the other counties around, because we have that data available to the plan.
But in terms of the impact of the plan, the impact will be within the Traverse City geographic limits, yes?
Right. The city proper.
Yeah, the
Yes.
city proper. And then I also didn't notice, and maybe I was just going too fast, projections for some of the demographics. I saw, you know, data comparing 2020 to 2010 to 2020 census data, for instance. I didn't notice any projections far beyond 2020. And I know this is a plan that should be in effect for a while with modifications. And I wondered if that was intentional, because you didn't feel you didn't have any reliable projections, or whether that was just something.
Yeah. There are no population projections, you're right, in the plan when it talks about it. And I mean, projections are just that, projections, hard to determine. And also relying on the 2020 census information can make it a little bit more difficult too. You know, we're still seeing what the outcome of that census is related to other census because of COVID and some of the data that we have. So I'm not really comfortable always projecting forward based on data that we have from the last, 4 or 5 years, just because so much changed quickly and it's still changing based on that. So it makes it really hard to get an accurate, well, I'm assuming, just because of the trends that we've seen based on that data from the past, that it'll be difficult to accurately project what will happen in the future.
And yet there are 5-year projections from the Census Bureau for the city, yes?
That they put out, that the census
The
put out?
Census Bureau, the American Community Survey does 5-year projections.
For counties.
I'll see if I can find it.
Okay.
But given that the orientation of the plan appears to be growth, I just wondered if there were some baseline assumptions about what kind of growth we're projecting that we should keep in mind as we read the plan.
I haven't done any projection look at the population for demographics.
Okay.
It's common, right, to base these.
Right, the existing information that we have, yes.
So the best that typically happens is that you'll take the change over a 10-year period and do a linear projection on that same rate of change into the future, because we don't know the variables that are going to change it. So it's a number, but it doesn't really have much meaning to it because it's just based on past change necessarily. So there isn't really any methodology that we have that can accurately predict. We can prepare for based on what's been occurring. We can likely anticipate occurring. But other than that, there's no clear science on any kind of population projections that give the data any merit.
Yeah, I understand that the metropolitan planning process was in its infancy when we initiated the master plan, but and I'm not expecting Rowan to go back and update all the numbers in here, but specifically looking at the map included on page 10 of the demographics section, yes, we had a micropolitan statistical area at that point, but since then, the U.S. Census has provided and TTCI has adopted a new map of the Traverse City metropolitan area and the Traverse City urban area with the data from the 2020 census. So I'd like to see that map updated since that is the framework that we're operating under. Otherwise, there's not inaccuracies aside from the village of Lake Ann is labeled as Interlochen.
So you said TTCI had updated them?
Yes.
Okay.
I had a similar question. We don't make any reference to in this, at least in you're talking about the Traverse City Micropolitan Statistical Area and whether or not, but you don't mention the metropolitan, the MSA that Traverse City qualified for the last census. Is that because of the timing when this was put together? Or is there, and is it something that can be added, or am I just not seeing it? Because I did not review demographic section.
Yes, so there's a delineation there. So there's a micropolitan statistical area and a metropolitan statistical area. And those are based usually around a core city and the people that commute from within. We are a micropolitan because we're small. If you were
We
in Detroit,
were, now we're a metro as of October.
these are different things, though. That's what I'm trying to delineate here.
Yeah.
So the census defined micropolitan statistical area and metropolitan statistical areas are based on the size within the commuting patterns of a city. A metropolitan planning organization is different from an MSA. Does that make sense? So they're two different
MSA
geographies.
is different than the MPO.
Exactly, yes. So what you see, we are not a metropolitan statistical area because we're not big enough in this region. We are a micropolitan, and that's the 4 counties that you see here. On page 10, what you see in yellow is the MPO boundary, the census-defined urbanized area. So they do it based on density, and then they send it to the MPO partners, so the city being one, and then we look and adjust that boundary based on where we know planned growth is going to be happening. So we've gone through that practice, to Mitch's point, and just recently adopted that. So it hasn't changed a lot from what you've seen here. It was kind of like the planners from each township are like, well, actually, we have a development coming down here, so draw the line like this, you know. But so those are the two different things.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
And so to Sarah's earlier point, we have to rely on the census's data that is based on those different geographies. So we can't always say just the city of Traverse City. Census tracts, for instance, you'll see that in some of them, they don't follow geographic boundaries of municipalities. They're their own boundaries. So sometimes we get stuck with having to analyze data that goes beyond the city's boundary. But that's the best data that we have, and that's pretty commonplace throughout. But at the end of the day, we do know that, you know, what happens in our surrounding townships impacts the city and vice versa. And so that's why we kind of take it all into account.
Right, and when you live here, you don't necessarily follow the line, I can't where you are, or you shop, you know, you look at as a whole, the area.
Yeah, and I understand that, and I would agree with that. I mean, you look at this map and you look at like Kalkaska County, and you talk to people in Kalkaska, and they don't really think of themselves necessarily as a Traverse City local. But you don't get to differentiate, you don't get to draw, you're not drawing the circle. The Census Bureau is, so it is what it is.
Yeah, they define it for us, and then we have to do it. And, you know, like, for instance, I went to Kalkaska, but Traverse City is where you came for everything because there was nothing there. And so it's like, yes, although we went to school there and stuff, like we were still part of this community as, you know, consumers, if you will.
And this is only one measure of everything, right? This is talking about population, you might be talking about Kalkaska County or about it too, but, you know, you're reading this this document kind of as a whole, and you don't want to just pick out one aspect of it. Oh, yes, we're talking about this. We rely on just that piece of information to make all of our decisions. You know, so to be kind of well-rounded in the thoughts, and this is one component.
Yeah, and I mean, it's, like you said, it's not perfect because, you know, we've got commuters coming from Antrim County, Missaukee, Wexford, Manistee, you know, at least the parts of them. You just can't address it. You know, you've got what you've got, so. No, I understand. Thank you.
Any other kind of comments or questions with demographics?
I'm just wondering, is there anything else to track while we wait for the next census to happen? So it says here, people over the age of 60 and have for 20. That was 40. So is there anything where you can track that kind of thing?
So a census is a census where the idea is everyone gets counted. In between, the Census Bureau does what's called the American Community Survey. And so each year they do a random sampling. Has anyone ever been called? I did once, and it was glorious to be part of it. But the key there is it's a sample. So most data-based qualifiers, like for instance, if you're going to apply for a DNR trust fund grant, they want to know what your median income is. You have to report what it is from the census. So the American Community Survey kind of tries to keep tabs on trends between the 10-year census. And they'll do this every year, and then they'll publish reports that are a 1-year estimate, a 3-year estimate, and then a 5-year estimate. So the 5-year estimate has 5 years of data into it, and therefore its margin of error is much smaller than the 1-year estimate because you've had 5 sample sizes or 5 samplings to combine to get that. And so that's kind of on a running basis. So at any point you can go through and look, but there's a lag from the end of a calendar year to when the Census Bureau processes that data and publishes it. So we might at best right now in 24 have the 21-22 ACS data, but that's about it. And to Sarah's point again, there's usually a lag of 1.5 to 2 years after the census year. That was much prolonged this time around because of COVID. The census was late. The processing of the data was late. So yeah, we're in a challenging time for census data. Like, haven't had a global pandemic
But
in the master planning
if
process.
these reports came out and we were to suddenly see a huge jump from what
You can incorporate it in. So, I mean, one thing we can do is, you know, this is set up with an action plan in that magazine component that has a 5-year timeline. So in 5 years, when we go to review, we can look at the ACS 5-year data and then update the demographic section as well, which might be an informative process to do as you go through that. Yeah, to the point earlier about projections, you know, one thing that we are aware of is we are one of the few regions in the state that is actually growing in population. And whether we like that or not, like that's the reality of what's happening. A lot of the MPOs we talked about earlier, their urbanized boundaries are actually shrinking as a result of this last census because they've lost population. We, on the other hand, crossed that threshold and became an MPO. And so we're experiencing that growth, not here in the city alone, but within this whole region. And from what I'm hearing from the various organizations, institutions that we talk with, that's projected or anticipated to keep occurring that way. Do you have anything to add? I'm just curious from NAR if they had anything.
About population growth?
Region, Aspire North or anything?
I mean, they might.
Okay. Just thinking of a comment Kim Pontius once made, so I don't know if it was a topic in your organization.
We look more at housing growth.
Yeah.
There are other sets of data, like how many residential units we have, how many voters we have, how many kids are in TCAP schools that can and have been used as proxies for population growth in other communities. But in a community like Traverse City with a significant second home owner population and a large tourist influx, those are much less useful as proxies.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, just a suggestion in terms of providing context. Yeah, there are certain statements out of the demographics section, like people over the age of 60 and the percentage of the overall population that they represent. Would it be burdensome to sort of benchmark those against state data and U.S. data to give us some sense of how distinct we are from the rest of the world? Help us to highlight.
Yeah, I think they are.
Page 13.
Yeah.
On page 13?
Traverse City Age Pyramid. Yeah.
And US?
I mean, I guess that would be a question. Typically, we just go up to the state,
Uh-huh,
like locally, and then surrounding.
right,
So that's how this is drafted.
yeah.
I guess I would. John, if you have recommendations, if you want to go out.
I think the rationale for it might be that we're in a pretty well-acknowledged low-growth state, and that it would help to understand what's going on a little bit more broadly, just to, if your belief is that Traverse City is growing more rapidly,
It's not a
Then-
belief, that's actual demographic
Yeah,
data. So let's
right.
make sure that's clear.
if you're making the point that Traverse City is growing more rapidly than the state, well, if the state is low growth, is that as important to us as if we're growing more rapidly than national benchmarks? I'm thinking, who exactly are we benchmarking ourselves against? And is it supporting your belief, or is it?
Let me just correct again, that's not a belief, that's data. Okay, Jackie. I
Thank
just
you.
want to
And
make sure that's
and the
clear.
data, I think, for Traverse City alone, wasn't it a 7% population growth between 2010 and 2020?
Mhm.
So that a goodly share of the growth in the area actually wasn't coming from Traverse City proper. I mean, less than 1% a year on average. 7% over a 10-year period
Yeah,
growth.
is there a question there?
Yeah, I'm
trying to
still back
understand
at my
it.
question about why would we benchmark ourselves against our low-growth state if there are other factors that should be considered in determining whether we are growing rapidly, as your statement says, or whether we are growing moderately, or whether we are growing slowly,
Yeah, I mean, in all my years, I'll let Sarah comment on this too. I've never been part of a master plan that reflects national growth because it adds no value to the local land use decisions. It's what's happening here locally, and then we benchmark it, to Sarah's point, against either the surrounding municipalities that make up your county, and then the next geographic up, which is the state as a whole. So that's pretty consistent practice in how you do this.
okay?
I think locally it's important to look local and against your neighbors. More so, I'm thinking of, when you're looking at your community, 8% to Traverse City, that's could be a large growth, it could be a small growth, I suppose, but it's relative to your neighbors is the growth. And versus looking at the country, the USA, and then, I mean, where do you stop looking to see if your, growth is good or bad? I think that it's definitely more important locally to your area. Even the state, I mean, I guess that gives you a perception overall to the state, but even to me, looking at planning, the state is large to look at, to compare to.
Okay. I think my point of view is that there are always going to be judgment calls in interpreting data, and I'd like to be sure that we are using a broad enough perspective in making those judgment calls, because they will drive land use decisions. Yes? Okay.
Brian?
Just a quick note, I mean, there is a projection in here for population on
Ooh.
page 12.
Page
Yes.
12.
And it's,
Yeah.
yeah, and it does predict that their population is going to either stay relatively flat or drop. And that's for, I think I don't know what it's for. It's a Traverse City
That's the
Micropolitan
micropolitan.
projection,
Yeah.
Looks
but
like
the numbers
City of
are
Traverse City.
in I think all those are the city numbers. Yeah, so I don't believe that, but, but like everything, that's a belief. I think as people just met a guy the other day, moved here from Arizona. He was tired of the heat and the dryness and the lack of water. So,
I met the same guy, I believe.
I do have a quick question. Is there, and I didn't see it, and again, I apologize, I didn't review this section. Is there data in here about how many homes are seasonal homes or non-residential homes? I mean, we have population and, on what we think about overnight, which is tourism, but do we have,
I think they get into it into housing, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, in the housing
Next chapter.
chapter, yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
We can get into that. Anything more related to the text of the demographic section? And again, like Sean mentioned, we're not finalizing anything here, and all the way including once it goes out for public review. You'll get to see the document again. You'll have a public hearing on it, and at that time, we still can, make some changes to the document if needed, and we will be going through and looking at, any of the typo or formatting issues that might be present.
Yeah, that is one thing I think we forgot to mention at the beginning. Beckett Rader does hire a third-party copy editor at the end with fresh eyes to go through and look for grammar and spelling and all that kind of stuff. So when you're reviewing these chapters throughout the next 5 weeks, you don't have to focus as much on that because that work will be done by a different party, just to make your burden a little easier.
It was more interesting than anything, but the where you non-family structure in Traverse City, living alone 15 to 64, that's their age, right? That's age, 15 to 64.
What page are you on?
I'm on page 15, sorry. And I only bring it up because that's a really broad range. And I'm not asking to have it broken down even further. It would be interesting to me to know how many people the age of 15 to 18 are living alone or whatever,
Yeah, and this section is so old, I can't tell you exactly why.
Just more interesting than anything.
That's what I want to say, but I can't be certain
Yeah.
that it's like that.
Does seem odd.
It just seems like a really broad age group to lump together, and especially for living alone.
It's basically 64 and younger,
Right.
65 and
Yeah,
older.
yeah, yeah.
It's like not children, not retired. It's
Yeah.
like everyone
Yeah,
in
I
the
mean,
middle.
we're
Yeah.
hoping there's no 15-year-olds in that
Right,
group.
yeah.
But, yeah.
There probably are some, and that's why I'd be curious, like, is it 10? Is it 100? Who knows,
Yeah, let me take a look and see if that's how the information came, or
Yeah.
any other comments on the graphic? Ready to move on to housing? So, this housing section, a lot of times we put housing right in with demographic. A lot of times we put housing right in with demographics when we're talking about a master plan, but you'll see here that we spent a lot of time on housing, and neighborhoods has its own chapter as well in the master plan. Just kind of looking all the way from the history of housing, and then, where we're going, why we are where we're at right now, and then some potential changes or ways to look at it. I know that the city has been, pretty progressive on different types of zoning reform related to housing, even your most recent amendments that went through. And so when we first drafted this chapter, those amendments they weren't a dream. The Planning Commission was working on them, right? But they hadn't been adopted, so we had to go back and update it to try to make sure that we incorporated those changes in this document even. But looking at all different types of housing, from aging in place and transitioning into housing to housing instabilities, and also looking at, like I mentioned, maybe some different types of additional zoning reform or changes that could happen, kind of just pointing them out at this point. And you'll see in the action plan, there is some talk of some zoning amendments related that we talk about in this housing thing here, but this is kind of just, here's some ideas, here's some thoughts. It's not necessarily a recommendation of what needs to happen, but here's what you could do or what you could work on. So any comments related to, nope. That's in the next chapter. Never mind. Any comments?
Quick question about housing types. So when we talk about multifamily units, we're saying 2 units and up are considered multifamily.
It depends. Depends on where you're at. Because there's some that are like multiplexes, so those are 2 and 4, and then there's other spots where there's multifamily just broadly as multifamily.
Well, are we counting a duplex in the 33% or in the 5% of units in attached single-family homes?
What page are you on?
I'm on
29.
29.
I would guess that would be attached, because otherwise the only attached single-family home that we have are like the Brownstone said Boardman.
Well, it's got, the 33 says 2 units and up in parentheses at the end of multifamily. So for this infographic, housing units that are multi are 2 units and up.
So it could be, to Brian's point, it could be a duplex. Single-family
Right.
house has been split down the middle or whatever.
Right.
Okay.
And I would say, I think that's, again, another example of how the census gives it to us. Because within our own ordinance and even the construction code, multifamily is 3 or more. So duplex has a different call out, but that's not how the census provides it.
Did anything surprise you in this housing section with any of the data that was?
I know people living on boats.
Boats?
Yeah.
I was on a boat this morning, but it doesn't have much room to live on.
Yeah, and we talked about that at the leadership team, and that's why there's kind of a paragraph that talks about it there related to rent. That's a hard one to, that's based on the census, and people have to report that, and, different information, and some people over-report or under-report. You're in charge of your own census form.
Yeah.
And in cases, that rent may be what that individual pays, but they may have 2 roommates that are paying the same amount. So,
On page 30, I found it interesting that nearly 58% of renters pay 30% or more in their monthly income. That's for Traverse City, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah.
Any other notes in housing?
The Housing North estimate
Page 26.
Seen here a couple of times. Yeah, so, is, I guess my question is just basically adjusting the number provided by Housing North, or is there any supporting documentation?
You'd probably have to go, I don't know specifically, but we just pulled it from the report from Housing North, so you'd probably have to go to Housing North to get their source information.
Okay, thank you.
And so, to that question that Sarah's referencing is the housing needs assessment, which is on the city's website. So Housing North commissioned, they hired a firm, Bowen National Research, to create a housing needs assessment for each of the 10 counties in the 10-county region, which we are obviously part of Grand Traverse. The city then went and paid additional to them to have the city done itself. So we have data on just the city. And I actually have that pulled up right now. I would recommend looking at it. It did inform a lot of this. And that data, Brian, is coming from the 2010, the 2020 census, Esri, which is the company that does all the most all the GIS data, as well as all their applications. Bowen's own research, and they cite Urban Decision Group as another firm collecting data and doing research on that. So that is where a lot of that came from. And that is granted on the topic of housing, but it does have a lot of good demographic information in there. That's why I pulled it up, because Jackie, you were asking about our rate of growth at, let's see, I have total household for within the city at 7.4% over the 2010 to 2020. The county itself grew at 9.5%, which that makes sense because there's a lot more green space to develop in the county. The region grew at 4.3%, and the state only grew at 2%. So that's all broken down there. They also use the American Community Survey to do the 2020 to 2022, what data they've collected since the census, to indicate those changes. And of those 4 geographies, the city is growing the fastest, with no growth in the state of Michigan at 0.0%. And then they used as best as they could to do a 5-year projection, and we are still projected to grow the fastest out of all the geographies, with Michigan actually as a whole losing population by 2027. So, but again, those are projections, and I would not, based on the methodology, I would not wager money on those projections. So there's so many variables that can affect population migration that can't be accounted for.
You know, there is one piece of data, one data point that might be helpful here. I'm looking at the housing instability section on page 47, and do you think there would be an opportunity to incorporate any early data from the most recent homeless census?
Any other comments on housing?
On page 30, housing units permitted by the city, it goes from 413 in 2022 to 215 in 2023. Do we just not have all that information, or is that the actual number?
Yeah, that's the actual number
Okay.
that was in our annual report, as well as in the,
Yeah.
I believe, the performance. So we noted when we presented a community housing profile in would have been 22, that we had that big spike in 21. And it really only takes a couple
Yeah.
large projects to really lift that up. We have seen a decrease in permitting, I would say, to date for this calendar year, much like we saw last year. And there could be a number of reasons. I mean, interest rates are very high,
Yeah.
construction costs are through the roof, so that kind of tempers it. developers that do those larger multifamily buildings, like predictability and like, that 447 reflects Innovo Hall Street. Well, that then got tied up for 2 years in court.
Right.
And so developers, they don't want to go down that road a lot.
Yeah.
So they tend to shy away when those things happen. So it'll be interesting to see where we end up this year, but I would say so far it's been really slow.
Okay.
But that tends to pick up in the spring. People start working and getting
Right.
the plans finalized.
Yeah.
You're not alone in that.
No,
I mean, that's what, from my experience from different communities I work with, permitting is down, maybe not down, similar maybe to last year, but down from previous years. It really kind of hit the brakes. And we didn't have a strong winter, so people kind of didn't slow down all winter either. We still were getting permits coming through.
and one thing that's interesting talking to my colleagues, if you will, in the surrounding townships is most of what they're getting permitting through their permitting is multifamily.
Right.
There's, Garfield's struggling. There's a demand for single family homes, but no one's building them right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
So not in mass.
One last suggestion. On page 51, you detail some of the changes in the zoning that were enacted last year. And I wonder, can you connect the dots between that and any building permits that appear to be leveraging these changes?
Yeah, the easy answer for that is there aren't any yet.
Okay.
So talked to Dave Weston, our zoning administrator, who issues those permits just a couple of weeks ago. Oh, maybe we got one since, but as of a couple of weeks ago, it was before our joint meeting, we hadn't permitted, lots of calls, most of it just local people wondering what they can do with their lot now with the changes. I think the most interest that we're getting right now is land divisions. Because of the smaller lot size, people can split lots that weren't splittable before. And I don't know if you can attest to that because they run through Katie, but that's most the change. But we haven't issued subsequent permits. They're going through the process of splitting the lot, getting it recorded. So we anticipate that'll come in the future, whether it's the original person splitting it or if they're selling it off.
Would it be worthwhile adding any editorial comments about that? As long as you're talking about the changes?
I mean, we could. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy to put a sentence in there that it's still forthcoming. But I mean, when we went through this process, this is typically what happens is when you make a change, it then takes a while to start seeing it materialize.
Kind of have to be careful writing sentences. As of now, we haven't gotten any requests. Maybe it's a generic that time will tell.
Right.
Yeah, it'll probably work.
Are we ready to move on to neighborhoods?
Yeah.
So for the neighborhood section, I mean, as you've read through it, we kind of spent some time looking at each of the neighborhoods and providing kind of an overview and then also some details about it. And I think this really kind of spun out of the open house, the original open house we had in the fall of 22. We asked about each neighborhood and if you would like to preserve, enhance, or transform, or what you thought that neighborhood should have. And then just taking from that and going out to each of the neighborhoods to try to get more input to look at specific areas that, as residents or people that are nearby to that neighborhood would like to see preserved, enhanced, and transformed. Keeping in mind that, some of these neighborhoods have names and are defined and other neighborhoods are not defined, or depending on who you ask, the line may move. So it's kind of a fluid line sometimes. And some names change over time as well. And so this is, looking at that and looking at each of the neighborhoods, like I said, and trying to provide a little summary for you. And then hopefully Sean and the planning office, they're able to take this information, and if somebody comes in and asks about a neighborhood, provide kind of a couple of pages explaining each of them.
Yeah, so for this exercise, which this is a little more unorthodox in plans, this is something new that we attempted with this, to do this neighborhood kind of summary for each one. We had to create our own kind of neighborhood boundaries for this exercise, because to Sarah's point there, not every residential area has a formal association. So we kind of took where the existing ones were, filled in the gaps. The names aren't official names. When we were going through this process, boom wasn't a thing, but that came out of this process towards the end. So these names are just for reference in this document. They're not officially assigned or anything, but we needed something to reference throughout this. But then we tried to set it up so that each of these is kind of organized similarly, so that in our office, we can print each of these out and have them available. So if someone's sitting there waiting, oh, let me look on the page or two about my neighborhood or another neighborhood or things like that, and they can kind of cross-reference those.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting going through and changing all that, because this is just a handy system to compile notes from different parts of town, and it's a useful organizational scheme. But there are a couple issues, like you have Base of Old Mission as neighborhood 23, when that area is actually now divided into 2 neighborhood associations. So I'm not saying to change it, but we could include a map showing where existing neighborhood associations are in Traverse City. And yes, this is just the names that were ascribed and boundaries that were ascribed internally, but I've been informed by multiple people that the area that is labeled as Hilltop Neighborhood, or number 12, is Buffy Hill.
Yeah, again, these aren't official names. These are just things that we had gone with. And
They are
with-
particularly proud of that name for some reason.
Yeah. I mean, even within my own neighborhood, there's fierce discussion over whether it's Sofo or Fernwood, and, so.
And something I think that the neighborhood actually kind of spun out of too, besides the open house, is looking at your minute walk, circles of walk and looking. And that's for the little kind of chart in each of the neighborhood indicators that it's got for each of the neighborhoods. We're trying to kind of bring that throughout to be able to see where some additional items might be needed, like food access or transit, and that can help in the future, hopefully, to say, okay, this neighborhood is underserved in some way, and being able to maybe focus in on that. And it may not be something the Planning Commission can do, but it would be able to help a different organization or group to be able to
Well, the
move that
Planning
forward.
Commission could, if it's recognizing that, hey, this area doesn't have this sort of commercial development that is completely lacking for the neighborhood, because it's not allowed in the 2 corridors that have commercial development.
Right. Yeah. So this was a fun chapter, and you can see there are some components that we're still working on getting information in there, just because we don't have it, or we're still working through that. Further neighborhood comments? Yes.
Yeah, I think you did a good job of describing the methodology for the Preserve, Enhance, Transform methodology on page 61. Where you're using percentages of responses, may I suggest that you also provide somewhere a raw number of respondents for each of the neighborhoods? I think that would help us get a sense of scope of the feedback.
For under the framework?
Yeah,
component?
under the future framework, for instance, Slabtown community support was 77% of how many? You know, maybe it's just a footnote needed, but
Okay. Last call for neighborhood comments?
I really like these.
I was just going to ask, who went out and walked 15 minutes away from the center of the neighborhood to?
We relied on technology to help a little bit.
I'm applying for a job is what I'm saying. Like, I want to go to every
Yes,
neighborhood
okay.
and walk 15 minutes.
Perfect.
There is software to do that.
Well, you need somebody to spot check the software, right?
Exactly, yes.
Okay. I got you. Okay, moving on to transportation,
A
mobility.
quick question, or maybe a suggestion. A suggestion. The number that changes the most constantly, is the median home price that you have in there. But you don't have a date on it. So if you did this last year, it's different, today. And it'll be different next week.
Yeah.
Well, not next week, but for neighborhoods, it'll be different. So
Yeah, I
if you
think
could
that's
add a little note on the date. So,
yeah, or we can even put a comment. Well, I hear you what you're saying. I understand. Okay, so transportation mobility. This is talking about, all the different types of transportations that we have here. It does reference the mobility action plan and some components, and we will need to pull some of the recommendations or some of the thoughts from that into, you can see there's a couple of notes in here about the mobility action plan, adding that in. But yeah, looking at going all the way from motorized, from vehicular, and parking and train and air. You are required to put the airport and the airport approach zones in the master plan per the Zoning Enabling Act, so those are included in here. And then looking at public transportation in here as well as some non-motorized information.
Are you guys familiar with how the airport approach zones work by chance? Maybe worth bringing up to you all. We're mostly impacted on the north side of the airport, so approaching the Basin Peninsula NMC. So basically, when the airport submits their airport approach zones and they get adopted by the state, what that essentially does is freeze your zoning that was in place in those airport approach zones at that time. So for us, it was July of 2001 is when that got approved. Now there's ways to get about it. In a perfect world, an airport would own and control all the land in those airport approach zones on page 116, and they would be vacant. But that's not reality. So this comes from the Michigan Aeronautics Division. So for instance, what they don't want is tall structures or structures that are going to have a lot of congregation of people and or hazardous material. So in the event there was some sort of air disaster, the impact would be minimized. The Airport Authority, which is its own authority as of, Mitch, do you recall, about 2 years ago, I think?
Yeah.
So they're now independent. They are working with the counties and townships and informing them on what's called an airport zoning board, I think. There's a zoning board and a zoning commission, so it gets a little confusing. One acts like the planning commission, the other one acts like the BZA, that would allow increase in intensity of use beyond what was allowed in 2001, but this new board would prescribe mitigating conditions that have to be met. So for instance, one that came up is where Tebow Florist is. that's a pretty low density area, and they're going to build a 43 unit senior living multiple family housing there. So they did get approval from an exception, if you will, from the FAA. If the zoning board was in place, what they could do then is say, yes, you can build that, but you need to make sure that there's air conditioning so that people don't have to open their windows, that the windows have extra soundproofing. In other words, they want to make sure that the airport isn't a nuisance. And it may be a situation where they're required to sign a waiver saying, I acknowledge I'm in an airport approach zone when they sign their lease. So those type of things. So I bring that up because they do have an impact on land use. But again, the airport authority is working on putting together that board and the guiding documents so that when projects do come up that may be at odds with the airport approach zones, that they can still move forward in the interest of the city.
I do find it interesting that the residential houses that are nearest to the airport are not actually in an approach zone, that being the aptly named Plainview Street off of Hastings.
Yes, and same thing with that one neighborhood. It's like Judson Street, maybe Georgetown over by 3 Mile. That's another one, but it's all based on the direction the planes approach from.
Yeah, so you might be physically closer to the planes, especially when they're at ground level, but they're not going right over your house.
Correct. And there's a reason the airport authority is working towards this, that they need to be compliant in order to get federal grants to do a lot of the improvements. So that's why they're kind of pushing back on getting some of these things established. Like in Otsego, there's an airport. They've had a zoning board in place for this purpose since the 1970s. We're just kind of late to the game. And now that it's an independent authority, now it's starting to come to the surface. But they've been good partners to work with. So.
Speaking of their organization, I noticed for Beta you had a fair amount of detail on the Beta's organizational structure. Would you consider going into a bit more detail on the Northwest Regional Airport Authority, given that it's a relatively new governance structure?
Yeah, like are you thinking like their board composition, their representation and stuff?
Yeah, and particularly their interactions with local communities.
Mm-hmm. Question.
Any other questions in transportation?
Sure. I think there was a factoid in there that 10.6% of Traverse City households don't own a car. I had a note that it was on page 110. Would it be possible to go any deeper into crosstabs on that to find out more of a demographic profile of who those people are? You know, is it related to age? Is it related to income? Is it, you know, are there other factors that would help us understand that group better?
Okay.
Yeah, we'll look into that. It's going to just depend on how the census provides that for us, but yeah, we can definitely.
And there could be other information out there if Beta or Norte or Tart Trails or some other transportation organization has done some consulting work.
You bet. Oh, and speaking of Beta, just a point of clarification, there was an indication that there were 281,000 Beta riders in 2022, and I just wanted to verify that those are indeed unique riders. Those are not rides.
I do believe those are rides.
They are rides.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
ready to move on to infrastructure? Okay. So this is, just about the city infrastructure, water, sewer, stormwater, we talk about, and then it talks about the energy, so TCL&P is included in here, related to energy. Did you find out too much about the water system and the sewer system that you never wanted to know when you read this section?
I probably missed this somewhere, but what does MGD stand for?
Million gallons a
Okay,
day.
million gallons a day, okay. So if I'm reading this table correctly on 125 water system demands, the city of Traverse City, our million gallons per day has actually decreased from 2019 to 2020.
Yeah.
Any reason for that? Or is that, again, census stuff?
Actually, I think that was because of the tourism decline in 2020.
Oh, yes, okay, that's
Because
a
a lot
very
of
good
it
point,
is
Katie,
that.
yes.
I
Thank
just
you.
toured the water treatment plant a few weeks ago.
Two things. One, there is a little separately covered paragraph on water, wastewater, and equity. The city of Traverse City has passed a resolution declaring access to water a fundamental human right, and there have been has been brought up a couple times if that is the city's effective policy. Should there be a better mechanism to allow for greater equity in our water rates? Say you have a lower base rate and policies to avoid utility shutoffs for people in exigent circumstances, but to my knowledge, those discussions haven't resulted in any changes in policy or steps towards drafting new policy. So I don't know if that would be something worth including or not. And under stormwater, it is mentioned that the stormwater asset management plan is the overarching document, but considering that this is a master plan, it is intended to be forward-looking, but based on the past, to include that stormwater asset management plan is from 2017 and 2007 and may be updated in subsequent years.
Where's that reference that you're looking at?
Page 127 in the section stormwater. That would be a separate sentence somewhere.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because unlike our water and our our drinking water or our wastewater that are updated continuously, that is something that we have a asset management plan that is at this point 17 years old, and may or may not be all that accurate anymore. So within, I don't know if it will happen 5 years, 10 years, at some point, that will get looked at again.
Okay.
And it could happen to be within the scope of this master plan.
Yeah, I can't find it, but I think this month, my calendar, there's a meeting with departments about stormwater plan and updating it. So
Glad to hear it.
can't see what day, but I remember seeing it come through my email.
Yeah, you're meeting with Andy Smits.
Yeah, and Ian Pagano. One thing I think it is worth drawing your attention to
you hear
in this
different
section
people
is
about
on
the same
page
meeting.
126. I just want to highlight our wastewater treatment plant because you probably hear a lot too that our wastewater plant is at capacity. It's really operating just over 50%. And it's a regional wastewater plant. So even if Traverse City never built another thing, the development that happens around us in the 5 other jurisdictions all feed into here. So Blair Township and East Bay Township, they both have their own water systems, but they're tied into the same regional, along with Acme, Long Lake, I believe, and not anymore. Garfield, Elmwood. Yeah, so they're all part of our whole system. Yeah. Peninsula Township, parts of it. So, the wastewater treatment plant has a lot of capacity still left in it. I also hear that every time it rains, sewage goes into the bay, and that's not really an accurate statement either. That did happen, I think it was in 2020. when
Yeah,
we had-
2020, there was one significant outflow and 2 minor outflows. Since then, there's been 1 minor outflow, but otherwise,
Yeah, and one of those outflows in 2020, the minor ones, it was coming from East Bay Township.
yeah.
Their pipe, but it happened to be in our city limits. And when that sewer pipe broke, they closed some beaches out of an abundance of caution, but there was never an E. coli spike or anything like that. They were just afraid that if water had gotten in a storm drain, it could have reached the bay.
And in those beach closures, after a high rainfall event that, yes, has more throughput in leaky pipes that are below the water table thanks to high lake levels, there's not enough data in that E. coli testing to say whether it actually came from the sewage leak or just a whole lot of goose and raccoon droppings that happen to be in our stormwater system that wash downstream.
So, yeah, I think it's clear that we don't have a lot of, I mean, we have limited, there's still some that exist, but we don't have a shared system like a lot of communities.
The combined sewage overflow.
Correct.
Yeah,
We
so
don't have, our issue is our pipes are, a lot of our underground pipes are old. When we get rain, it rains inside the pipes because the pipes are old. They leak, water infiltrates the pipe, and that overflows the sewage system. But, just this whole project going on, down Grandview Parkway, that's why we're replacing all those sewer lines. That's one of the reasons. But it's not just the city mains, it's also a lot of people's leads. Some of these leads on these 150-year-old homes are literally 150-year-old sewer leads. And when it rains, you run a scope down there, you'll see it rain in those pipes, literally.
Yeah, so what Brian's talking about, CSOs, combined sewage overflows, it was a historical practice throughout the country is that stormwater systems would feed into your sewer system and then go to your water treatment plant. 2 downfalls there. One, then you have to pay to treat stormwater as if it's sewage. And if you got a heavy rainfall, it would overwhelm the system and then raw sewage would overflow. We don't have that system here, which is great. My wife recently was in Cleveland and she was on a beach and she's like, look how pretty it is. And it was on Lake Erie and a giant sign that said, warning, combined sewage overflow, do not go on a beach when it rains. So it's like, they still exist out there. But Brian was also talking about infiltration and inflow. So those are the 2 forces with your sewer system where either water is entering into the pipes. Those pipes, being old, they have roots that go into them. They're not really sealed. Sewage pipes, unlike water pipes, are not under pressure. They're gravity flowed most of the time. We do have some force mains in locations and lift stations. The other one is we have all those manhole covers. So when you get a heavy rain, that's additional water that goes into the sewer. So in a way, during those heavy events, when you have high water, you do kind of have a CSO type system. It's not intentional, but that's the effect. Now that one major outflow into the Boardman River was kind of a perfect storm. We were record high water, so the old sewer pipe was below the groundwater, so that was happening. We had I can't remember if it was a 100 or 500 year storm. After that flow, they went into that sewer pipe and they found a fatberg. So that is a phenomenon that happens in sewage pipes. They say don't put grease down your drain because it starts to coagulate in the sewer pipe. So there was a huge mass of fat in the pipe that cut the capacity down by 30%. And they found an 8-foot long, like 2x6 or 2x8 board that somehow got in the sewer pipe that was blocking capacity. So that's all been addressed and there hasn't been an overflow since. I don't know if it's still there, but I know prior to when they moved the sewer and reinforced that wall last year, I think it was, they were keeping a bypass pump down there by where it happened. So if we do have a heavy rain, we can bypass that
Yeah.
choke point in the sewer system to prevent that from happening again.
The auxiliary pump is not there, but thanks to the lake levels dropping, it's not as much of an issue.
And one thing that the city's been working on, and Brian might be able to speak to this from his time on the commission, and Mitch, is they've been going through and lining the pipes. So rather, it's very expensive to replace a sewer pipe. You got to rip up a street in some instances. So one way to extend the life of the pipe and cut down on that inflow is to line the pipe. So they go through, and it's like a hard epoxy that does it. But, you know, pipes used to be cast iron. They've found ones in the city that were hollowed out wood. That's what they used to use for sewer pipes, and in some places, that's what's down there still. The other part that's clay, a lot of clay. The leads, so you have sewer mains. The leads are the individual pipes that go from the main to your house. Those are privately owned. So, you know, a lot of times the city's not monitoring those because it's not the city's, it belongs to the homeowner. Yeah, and people sometimes are pretty disappointed. They'll have a sewage problem, realize it's in their portion that they own, and they're on the hook for fixing it.
Is it worth recognition? But that as we do the project,
Yeah, I think we can definitely do that.
In the city, pretty much, you have major projects. That's one of the reasons the way they pick streets for total reconstruction, is they look at the quality of the infrastructure underneath the street.
Yeah.
So they may take a street that's in worse and better they may pass in a street's in worse condition and take one because the infrastructure, the sewer lines or whatever, are in greater need of repair.
Yeah.
So that's not uncommon. Or one street has a main, the other ones have mains and alleys.
Yep.
So,
No, it's definitely part of it. A lot of people think pavement condition is the only thing that determines when a street gets reconstructed as to repaved, and sometimes the reconstruction is waiting on finding a funding source to pay for the infrastructure, because I lived in a community they did a great job of paving new streets, and the next year they'd rip it up and do the sewer pipe. So we try to avoid that as much as possible.
Dig once.
Yeah.
Anything else for infrastructure?
I think it's really cool, the UV disinfection. It's totally nerdy, but it brings us on par with, like, you know, 5-star communities around the globe. So I think that's pretty cool. Another question I had was, in equity and green infrastructure on page 128, the little box that says, you know, talking about green infrastructure, poor air quality. I'd be curious to know what Traverse City's air quality is, because just that wording, it alludes to the fact that Traverse City has poor air quality. I don't think we do, but and maybe that's just you know, you can word it differently. Page 128, and then equity and green, yeah, the little blue box.
But isn't that just a general?
Yeah, I'm just reading it from, like, the first time I read through it, I thought it was kind of alluding to Traverse City having poor air quality, and that could just be where my brain goes. I don't know, but
well, if you come into my neighborhood in the spring and you look at the clouds of pollen, I agree with that.
okay, all right.
So,
Yeah.
no, I mean, yeah, I understand your point, though, yeah.
Well, as we kind of discovered last year when we had the wildfires in Canada out west, air quality is something that
True.
can change on a day-to-day basis and is inconsistently monitored across North America in general and Michigan in particular. Like, okay, we have some air quality monitoring done at the airport, we have some done in Empire, but for a more robust sampling, you have to rely on data from Gaylord. which, okay, that can tell you for a large air mass that includes wildfire smoke, but that doesn't tell us about specific issues in Traverse City.
Fair.
To get that more granular data, they have it for southeastern Michigan, so you can say, oh, the U.S. Steel plant in Zug Island is putting out more sulfur dioxide than we want, and it's showing up as these spikes. But we don't have that level of granular data here.
Yeah, we could see what data exists out there, but yeah, it is challenging, like with the wildfires, is that air quality is a non-point source pollution. For a while there, one of the counties that had the worst air quality in the country, or in the state, I want to say it was Benzie. It was, which is interesting. It's the smallest county in the state, but their air quality was impacted by industrial uses in Wisconsin on the other side of the lake
yeah.
that the prevailing winds would then blow across.
And
So,
because
They
you
still
have
get that.
the
They still
hills
do.
that are about 10 miles inland.
kind of block it.
Block
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
But I mean, let's face it, I mean, we pollute here too,
Oh, yeah.
so, and it just floats over
West.
to Kalkaska.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
In the section on energy, I understand that we do have our own city-owned utility, Traverse City Light and Power, and it's useful to show the mix of energy sources for that and have a nice map. But I would like to, since that does put us into the broader context of a statewide energy landscape, to show that there are also state-level commitments to increase increase renewable energy generation, specifically in wind and solar, and that there have literally thousands of megawatts in wind and solar been brought online in the last 10 years, including many projects that might be actually closer to Traverse City than some of the ones that we are financially a partner in, but we don't have any more stake in that specific generating plant.
Well, then, that's all that we had outlined for tonight, and we'll pick it up next week, next Tuesday, on the remaining portion of the supplemental information for you.
So that's chapters 6.
Most of them, they're in that memo that
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Was
the
in your
memo had things
packet.
missing,
6,
so
7, 8,
I forgot the
9,
tourism.
10, 11.
Tourism one?
And tourism.
I swear I took that picture.
Will there be a
tourism
new
allowed?
version of the magazine coming out that will be complete with the executive summary and things like that?
That, we're working on the zoning plan for that, so there's a potential that would be before, because that's another couple weeks away till we get to the magazine, so I'm hoping to have more information for it.
Okay.
But there's nothing, the text that currently exists in the magazine, there's no changes to that. There may be additional text added to it.
Looking to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Will we review those together, the magazine itself?
Yeah, the magazine is what we're gonna do on April 30th.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
There was a memo, that's all broken out.
Yeah, so we have this week and next week for the master
Yeah.
plan supplemental, 2 weeks for the mobility plan, and then the 5th week is the prescriptive magazine part. Now that this is the context, this is the,
You want Katie to send that memo out again before?
Well, it'll
we'll
be
send a
in
packet out
the-
by Thursday.
Yeah,
Oh, but the breakdown will be.
I'll have this
Okay.
Yeah, we'll have that all in
but
there.
corrected.
And I want to emphasize too that just because we're done with these chapters, at any point, if there's something that you saw that you want to revisit, of course, we can. So just make sure you're aware of that. I know it's a lot of information to digest. It is. And it's quite a bit. If you're feeling tight on time for the next one, the plan review section, it's good information, but it's just a summary of each one. There's not a whole lot of dialogue that needs to occur there. So if you feel you need to, that's chapter 12, cut something, you can feel free to do that. Chapter 13, as it's presented right now, is actually going to be moved. That's a report that came out of this process. So that's going to be placed in the appendix. That's the community engagement report from the first half of the process. So that's just going to kind of be moved as an appendix item for reference. But this has been created and distributed and on the websites and stuff for over a year now. So I think that's all we got.
And we did receive the one email with comments.
Yeah.
So that concludes our master plan discussion. We have reports, city report. On my agenda.
We spoke about road salt for 36 minutes yesterday,
Okay,
which is shorter than we have for previous years.
excellent. What was the conclusion?
We're buying some salt.
All right.
But we're buying a vastly reduced amount of salt. Last year, we purchased 2,000 tons, and this year, we're purchasing 600 tons and making use of the 1,000 tons that we still have on hand from last year's purchase.
By some measures, we didn't even have winter this year.
Reporting from the city commission? Right. No,
Is there a schedule for when that will?
April 10th.
Okay.
The first meeting of the riparian buffer committee will be April 10th.
And those are public meetings, so anyone can attend. There'll be an agenda posted.
And
That is not yet. No, still working on that.
anything else from the planning department?
So last night, the city commission did approve the Ida Tompkins building across the street being rezoned. So we've had conversations already on the site plan with the property owner, mostly how they plan to redo some of the parking. The gist of it is they'll be eliminating some of that asphalt on the south side of the building along the alley. There'll still be parking there, but more defined parking spaces, and they're going to be planting some vegetative buffers on the east side with the residential properties right there, filling in that space. The city is working to do a joint meeting tentatively June 18th. Don't write that date down. We'll find out for certain. With this group called Flywheel out of the Grand Rapids area. Ryan Kilpatrick of that company is essentially that region's Yarrow Brown. So what she does for Housing North, he does a lot of down there in Grand Rapids area through their Housing Next program. At the Housing Summit this year, he and Leah Dumichel from the Michigan Association of Planning, who used to be our boss at Beck and Rader, they gave a presentation on housing, kind of under the umbrella of this national zoning atlas that's being worked on. And they're asking each state to participate. And so Michigan has been participating, but in other words, it's creating a national database of what type of housing can go where. So we have a nice idea of it and doing it at the state level. And he gave a presentation that I did not attend, but our city attorney did, and she thought it was pretty great information. They've been working with the University of Michigan on a lot of their data and analysis. So they'll be doing a community presentation at a joint meeting towards the end of June. We're looking at doing it at the Opera House. It'll probably be a joint meeting of the DDA, the Planning Commission, the City Commission, but we're doing it there because we want as much public to be part of it. And they're working on figuring out a way to make the whole thing interactive so members of the audience as well as the boards can participate in questions and things like that. Probably using something like Mentimeter that we've used before at some of our meetings. And it'll be televised as well. So just want to start promoting it now. They'll be visiting at the end of the month with staff to get a better idea of what data we have available for them. But kind of excited. I didn't get to see that presentation, but again, I heard great things about it at the Housing Summit. And I think that's about it. We're just coming off spring break, so things are feeling a little foggy for me, at least.
Is there any public comment? So, we need to move to adjourn.
I think you just
We will adjourn. Everybody have a nice rest of your week.
see you again next week.
In this room.
Yeah, we're doing it in this room, feels a little less formal, easier to have conversations.
Yeah.
I know 6 o'clock is around dinner, bring food, don't be offended, please. Do what you want.
Eat your yogurt, bring snacks.
There would be a sunset over